The GPS voice didn't stutter when it told me to turn onto a road that simply did not exist. I followed its calm, synthetic command down a gravel track swallowed by pines that grew too close together. 3 miles in, the satellite signal vanished, leaving only the blue arrow floating in a void of white static. Then the trees began to warp, their bark twisting into familiar silhouettes against the bruising twilight. Branches stretched out like her arms, reaching for the car window with desperate, jagged fingers. I saw her face in the knot of an oak, eyes wide and pleading behind the rough wood grain. My hands shook on the wheel as every shadow seemed to wear her wedding dress. The engine sputtered, dying not from fuel but from a sudden, suffocating cold that filled the cabin. I realized then that the map wasn't guiding me away from danger, but toward a memory I had tried to bury. The voice returned, clearer than before, whispering my wife's name with perfect affection. I understood why the road had no end. It was never meant for the living to travel. This route only appears when you are finally ready to stop running from her grave. The silence between my teeth and his was heavier than the rain hammering against the windshield. I had given him a lift on a deserted stretch of highway, drawn by the desperate tremor in his hands as he gripped the dashboard. He didn't speak, only stared ahead with wide, unblinking eyes, claiming that something ancient was hunting him through the night. Every few seconds he would flinch, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting a clawed hand to reach through the glass. When I finally caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, the road behind us was perfectly clear, devoid of headlights or footprints. There was no pursuer, no monster, only the endless void of empty asphalt stretching back into darkness. Yet his breathing grew louder, a wet, rattling sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and up into my spine. I watched his chest heave in the dim glow of the instrument panel, realizing too late that the fear wasn't in his eyes but in the way his shadow detached itself from his back. The empty road behind us wasn't empty because he had escaped. It was empty because everything else had already been consumed. He turned to me then, a smile splitting his face far too wide for human anatomy, and whispered that we were both part of the thing now. I tried to slam on the brakes, but my foot passed through the pedal like smoke. The hitchhiker wasn't running from something behind him. He was running ahead of it, dragging me into the same inevitable end. And as the world dissolved into static, I realized the rearview mirror didn't show the past, but what we had become. The first time I saw my social security number carved into the bark of an oak tree, I thought it was a prank by some bored hiker with too much time on his hands. But as I kept driving deeper into the suffocating blackness of the interstate, every single mile marker bore those same 9 digits scratched violently into the metal posts. It wasn't just vandalism. The numbers were changing, decreasing with terrifying precision with every mile I covered. 9,000 became 800, then 72, until finally, the marker simply read 0. My hands shook so hard against the steering wheel that the leather creaked in the silence of the empty cabin. I tried to rationalize it as a glitch in my perception, a symptom of the exhaustion that had been gnawing at me for days. But then I saw the headlights approaching from behind, bright and unblinking, reflecting off the wet asphalt like eyes in the dark. They didn't slow down, instead they accelerated, matching my speed with predatory intent. The radio static suddenly cleared, replaced by a voice that sounded exactly like mine, whispering that I was late for my appointment. I looked down at the passenger seat and found a file folder containing my own obituary, dated for today. The car door handle turned from the outside, not because someone was trying to get in, but because something was already inside waiting for me to stop. The dial was turned to pure white noise, but then it cleared into my own voice, speaking in real time about the deer I would see in 30 seconds. I slammed on the brakes just as the animal leaped from the tree line, confirming the terrifying accuracy of the broadcast. My heart hammered against my ribs as the radio continued, describing how I would pull over to check for damage. I did exactly that, killing the engine and stepping out into the cold mist, paralyzed by a dread I couldn't name. Beaker crackled, narrating my frantic search of the undercarriage with a calm, detached tone that sounded nothing like fear. I heard myself curse on the airwaves before I even opened my mouth to speak the word. Returning to the driver's seat, I gripped the wheel until my knuckles turned white, desperate to break the loop. The voice warned me that taking the next exit would lead to a bridge with weakened supports. I slammed the gas pedal, aiming for the highway on-ramp instead, ignoring the instructions completely. But as I merged onto the dark road, the radio shifted tone, describing the sudden failure of my front brake line. I pumped the pedals frantically, feeling them sink uselessly into the floorboard as the car surged forward uncontrollably. The narration reached its climax, detailing the precise moment the guardrail would give way to the river below. I closed my eyes, waiting for the impact that the broadcast had promised since we began. It wasn't a prediction of the future. It was a recording of the past, playing back from inside my own wrecked car. The flashlight beam cut through the rain, illuminating a solitary figure standing dead center in the lane, waving frantically for me to pull over. I slammed on my brakes, tires screeching against the wet asphalt, heart hammering against my ribs as I prepared to help. but when I came to a complete halt, the road ahead was empty, stretching into an endless void of darkness. Confused and shaken, I eased back onto the highway, only to see the same silhouette standing 50 yards further down the road. It wasn't walking, it was simply there, waiting with that same desperate, silent plea. I sped up, convinced it was a trick of the light or a prank gone wrong, but the figure remained at a constant, impossible distance. Every time I tried to close the gap, it vanished and reappeared further ahead, maintaining an eerie equilibrium. I checked my speedometer, then my rearview mirror, praying for police lights or another car to break the tension. There was nothing but the rhythmic thumping of the wipers and the growing dread coiling in my stomach. The figure's face was obscured by shadow, yet I felt its gaze burning into the back of my neck, demanding I follow rather than help. I realized then that it wasn't waving for assistance. It was hurting me, guiding me away from safety and deeper into the isolation. My phone had no signal, and the exit signs had long since faded into obscurity, leaving me with only one path forward. The horror wasn't that I couldn't stop, but that I finally understood why I never could. I wasn't driving toward the figure. I was being driven away from the crash site where I had died miles ago. The streetlights hummed to life one by one as my headlights cut through the 50-year dust of Oakhaven, revealing a town that should have been nothing but rot and memory. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, watching in disbelief as shadows detached themselves from every brick facade and pressed against the glass. They didn't move with the jerky uncertainty of raccoons or stray cats. They stood with rigid human posture, their dark outlines perfectly aligned with the frames of windows that had been boarded up since 1974. The silence was absolute, save for the low thrum of my engine and the distant crackle of electricity powering a grid that had supposedly collapsed decades ago. I slowed to a crawl, expecting some pranksters or squatters, but the air smelled only of wet ash and ancient decay. One by one, the silhouettes turned their heads in unison, tracking the slow rotation of my tires on the cracked asphalt. A chill crawled up my spine, heavier than the cold dampness seeping through the car's floorboards, because I realized they weren't just watching me pass, they were waiting for me to stop. I considered reversing, but the road behind me had vanished into an impenetrable fog that mirrored the darkness ahead. As I passed the town square, a figure in the largest window raised a hand and pointed directly at my dashboard clock, which read 3:00 a.m., the exact time the blackout was supposed to have begun. The streetlights flickered violently, plunging the scene into momentary darkness before surging back with blinding intensity. In that sudden glare, I saw that the windows weren't reflecting the outside world. They were empty voids where faces should have been. I slammed on the brakes just as the front porch of the first house collapsed inward, revealing not a living room, but a wall of eyes staring out from the brickwork itself. The radio static cleared for a single second, broadcasting my own voice screaming in a language I didn't know but somehow understood perfectly. They weren't residents watching a stranger drive through their abandoned home. They were the memories of the town, and I had just become their new vessel. The wind howling through the cracked window sounded less like air and more like a wet, ragged gasp. I was miles off the main highway, chasing a signal that didn't exist on any map, when the headlights of an oncoming semi blinded me. The truck driver wasn't looking at my license plate or my erratic swerving. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and fixed directly over my left shoulder. He rolled down his window at 60 miles per hour, screaming a warning that cut through the noise of the storm. I reached for my phone to call for help, but my fingers froze when I heard the distinct sound of wet skin dragging against vinyl upholstery. The rearview mirror was too dark to see clearly, but I felt the sudden, unnatural drop in temperature inside the cabin. It wasn't just cold, it was the absence of warmth, a void that seemed to pull at my very breath. A long, pale limb with too many joints unfolded from beneath the seat, moving with a jerky, insectal grace. The truck had passed, but the echo of his scream still vibrated in my chest, warning me of what I refused to acknowledge. I finally understood why he hadn't braked. Braking would have only given it more time to settle in. Now that I've stopped the car to face it, I realize the mistake wasn't looking back. It was ever getting into this vehicle alone. The thing behind me isn't hunting me. It's waiting for me to turn around so it can show me what it did to the last driver who ignored its presence. And as the passenger door slowly creaks open from the outside, I hear the trucker's voice whispering from the empty road, "Too late."